afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the last of the webinars, which has been part of this Solidarity series, Conversations During Lockdown and Beyond. We are very happy to see some familiar faces and names throughout the last 17 days. And thank you for being with us. So on behalf of Center for Financial Accountability, I would like to take a couple of minutes before we start today's session. I would like to thank everyone who encouraged us and have been with us in hosting this series of webinars during this critical time of a global lockdown. Before we start today's session, CFA extends its gratitude to all friends, comrades, and colleagues who have been extremely encouraging to run these series. And it definitely would not have been possible without all of you. And more importantly, CFA remains indebted to all our speakers who agreed to speak at such short notice, and all our moderators who facilitated the very informative and absorbing conversations. And we're also very thankful to the many, many enthusiastic volunteers who have been burning the midnight oil in transcribing and editing these webinars to ensure a wider outreach. And lastly, I would like to thank everybody in the CFA team who's been working behind the scenes and making those timely phone calls, fixing all the technology glitches, and ensuring the series is running smooth. So welcome again. And I would also like to make another little announcement. So towards the end, we thought we will also get a little feedback from a few people. So kindly wait with us after the session as well, just for a couple of minutes. So today's session has been titled Planetary Emergencies and Prospects for Climate Justice. We're all seeing that lockdowns across the world have already resulted in a significant drop in greenhouse gas emissions and pollutants. And the pandemic has shown that governments and societies do have the capacities to apply these emergency brakes on the violent economic behavior that we've seen for years now. While the world deals with the pandemic in a small island on the southwestern Pacific Ocean called Vanuatu, a cyclone named Harold, which is supposed to be a Category 5 storm, is devastating the lives and livelihoods as we talk. And relief is delayed by the coronavirus contamination, it is feared. So this shows us how unprepared the world's political and economic leaders are, despite the many lessons from past crises. So in the days to come, when things settle down, life will probably never go back to normal. A combination of COVID and climate change induced impacts will continue to wreak havoc on the planet's lives and livelihoods. And soon access to food, water, shelter, energy, and environmental justice will be really big challenges. Business as usual is probably not going to be possible. And gaps and inequalities will definitely widen further. So what then is the solution forward? Our speaker for today, Dr. Prakash Kashwan, discusses this and more. And according to him, in his recent works, he says we need to look beyond the conventional notions in which climate justice is synonymous with international justice. He discusses in his work titled Rooted Radicalism, Food, Energy, Water, and Environmental Justice in an Age of Climate Change, where he conceptualizes climate justice as a multi-scale, multi-sectoral pursuit. So thank you, Dr. Kashwan, for agreeing to be part of this series. And to introduce him to all of our participants today, Dr. Kashwan is an associate professor at Department of Political Science, University of Connecticut. He's also co-director of Economic and Social Rights Research Group at Human Rights Institute. He's an interdisciplinary social scientist and a member of the expert group for scoping of transformative change assessment at the Intergovernment Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. He is a faculty affiliate of the Ostrom Workshop at Indiana University, Bloomington, a senior research fellow at Earth System Governance Project, and co-convener of the Climate Justice Network. And before I hand over the forum to him, a little request to you all, to all of us here, to keep our microphones on mute and our cell phones on silent mode. And also, I would encourage at the end or even in between, if you have your questions and comments, to type it in the chat box, because that will help us save a lot of time. And in case there is an internet glitch, Gaurav, Maju, Priya, one of us will take over and continue with the moderation. So thank you again, and welcome again, Dr. Kashwan, and over to you.
Thank you, Bhargavi, Joe, Gaurav, and CFA. I'm really privileged to be part of this Solidarity series. And thank you for naming the series as such. And I hope that some of the commitments of Solidarity will actually reflect in the comments that I'm going to make. Thank you, everybody, for being part of this discussion. There are many of you whose work I've learned from, either in activism or in academia. So I really appreciate this opportunity to sort of talk about some of these important questions. Just a logistic announcement, as I was saying, somehow once I put the headphones on, I cannot actually seem to speak properly. So I put this, I won't probably hear you. If there's some kind of intervention, please do the text chat or something. Thanks. So with this, I'll share my PowerPoint with you and then start right away with the. Okay. So, as Bhargavi's nice and introduction kind of made clear, that there are a number of people who are making this argument that the ongoing pandemic shows us that if the world actually decides to put brakes on, it can do so. And it has resulted in some environmental benefits. I want to kind of scrutinize that chain of arguments a little bit, and then use this opportunity to talk about environmental emergencies that have already been in place, right? So people demand climate emergencies, assuming that there are no emergencies already in place. And I want to argue that for some people, there are all kinds of environmental emergencies that are already in place. And we can, by studying those pre-existing and actually long-standing environmental emergencies, we can learn something about this intersection of emergencies and environmental protection. So after doing those brief points, I will then talk a little bit about the politics of global climate crisis and what are the justice implications. And towards the end of the talk, then I'll switch to talk about the pathways forward. And this is not, the last portion is not just about the emergency situation, but sort of the climate justice struggle and pursuit more broadly. So yesterday, as I was preparing this PowerPoint, there was this study that there's been a survey where I think this was in UK, where a significant proportion of public wants radical responses to climate change with the same kind of emergency mode as we have seen in the context of COVID-19. So this probably, some people would argue that this makes a case for declaring climate emergencies. It's very important to note in this particular context that the pandemic is global, emergencies are all national, right? And the way in which emergencies have been enacted and they are unfolding actually reflect the socio-political context of specific countries. That's one thing to remember. The second thing is for the activists who want to demand declaration of emergencies, it's important to also consider that even if we get what we wish for, how it is enacted and enforced may not be under our control at all. Because if there's one thing that the ongoing emergencies show us, it is the limits of civil society interventions at the big platform, in terms of shaping this, the contents and the forms of emergency. So as Naomi Klein has been arguing for a long time, we have already seen a number of evidences of disaster capitalism consolidating the ways in which capitalist system is trying to take advantage of the ongoing emergencies. But we have also seen the emergence of what I would call as disaster authoritarianism. And I think it's reasonable to argue that without disaster authoritarianism broadly understood, probably we wouldn't see a lot of disaster capitalism. So in that sense, I would argue that disaster authoritarianism, which includes undermining of democratic institutions, that is a more fundamental question, even if our goal is to understand how disaster capitalism function and what its implications for climate action are. So in the context of the ongoing emergencies, this is a picture from Cape Town, South Africa, where you know about the gaping inequalities there. In Manila, Philippines, there was a group of activists and citizens who were demanding social assistance and food assistance, and they were arrested by police. And of course, we all know the great exodus that we saw in Delhi and other parts of India, as a result of the particular way in which the emergency, the lockdown was declared. So it actually tells us a lot about the intersection of inequality and emergency. While there have been a lot of discussions of this particular intersection, what the lockdowns and the declarations of emergencies show us is that the starkness of socioeconomic inequalities becomes even more clear and even more pressing and even more real in the context of an emergency. And somewhat counterintuitively, you would expect that if something is becoming more visible, it should gain greater public support for the rights and the entitlements of poor people. But that story is not so neat, right? What we have seen is that in many ways, the legitimacy of the claims and entitlement of poor people has been undermined in the context of this emergency. And part of this is reflected, mediated very significantly by the role of political system, the political regime, the political leadership, right? So it doesn't operate in the same ways everywhere. And in that sense, the discussion should not just be a conceptual discussion about what, how, and when of the emergencies, but it should also be a discussion of who's implementing and enforcing the emergencies. So as we demand climate emergencies, I think we need to think more broadly about the complex relationship between inequality and emergencies, much more broadly than we have probably thought in the past. So, and I mentioned that, if you think about the forest dependent people in India and all over the global South, they are already living under all kinds of environmental emergencies. So this is a picture from Harda, Madhya Pradesh, where a group of forest officers and police officials came to demolish these hutments that you see. They don't seem to be very sustainable according to the forest department definition. There are shoot to kill orders in many, many wildlife areas around the world. And so if you think about the kind of powers that emergencies provide to policymakers and to law enforcement, the forest people of the world have already been living under certain kinds of emergencies, and many of them have actually paid for these emergencies with their life. So I've done some research trying to sort of disentangle these linkages between inequality, political institutions, and the regimes of environmental protections. I won't go into the details of the study, but in a sample of 137 countries, I find that the regimes of protected areas devoted exclusively to wildlife and biodiversity conservation are concentrated in two countries with two kinds of characteristics. One, countries with very high levels of economic inequality, and especially if those countries with high economic inequality also happen to have poor democratic institutions. So you think about authoritarian political systems coupled with high levels of economic inequality. The environmental emergencies of sorts that I talked about have actually worked very well under those conditions. And there are actually reflections of what's going on under the current lockdown, where we, it's lots of media, international media has reported that India's lockdown has been very successful, and it has been successful at the cost and because of the inequalities that are endemic and entrenched within our society. But the other important part, and again, I can't go into the details, we can definitely talk more during the Q&A, but it's not a trade-off of social justice and environmental conservation. If we get the environmental conservation regimes through these processes that ride on the backs of inequalities, those kinds of environmental gains are never sustainable. This has been shown time and again. So with that, I want to like to shift gears a little bit and talk about climate justice, particularly the way it has been framed conventionally in the realm of international climate justice. And I want to talk about two sort of perverse consequences of the international climate justice debates. One is that they have encouraged, in many cases, national governments to exploit this notion of international climate justice to pursue business as usual and to support the corporate collaborators of the regimes in place. Second, the international climate justice discourse, which focused on emission reductions and the actions of the global north to reduce emissions, have led to what should be called as carbon reductionism of climate action. So climate action has been reduced to degree centigrades, whether it is 1.5 degrees centigrade or the atmospheric space that you talked about. Now, this is not to say that the arguments about international climate justice are not valid. The Center for Science and Environment made those arguments about 3 decades ago, and those arguments still hold true. If you look at the obligations to the responsibility to reduce emissions, even today in the bigger scheme of things, in the accumulated emissions, India's share of what it has to reduce is actually almost non-visible on this figure that you see on the right. But as I said, for the 30 years that we've been having these debates, what we have seen in India, in precisely those 30 years, corporations, especially those benefiting from fossil fuel subsidies, like all kinds of petroleum, fossil fuel related corporations, or any of those other corporations who benefit from subsidies, they have benefited, and inequality has gone up in a very significant way. In fact, inequality has risen in India more than most other countries in the world. And poor people have gotten more, have poorer, and we have lost in terms of environmental or climate gains. We have not made any real progress in terms of addressing the climate challenges. So more radical climate action will not actually lead to more climate justice. So in the international frame of discussion, because developed world was supposed to do more emission reductions, that was taken to be synonymous with climate justice, because if developed world does more reduction, it leads to justice for the developing countries. That was the argument. But if we think about how those reductions are now actually being planned to be done, so we have failed to address the big elephant in the room, which is the fossil fuel corporations and the entire economies that run on fossil fuels. Now we are looking increasingly at forest-based and other kinds of terrestrial emission reduction options, and each of those options are filled with innumerable possibilities of large-scale violations of human rights, land rights, livelihood rights, and so forth. So, if we fail to address the fossil fuel economies, we will be forced to then rely on options that will clearly lead to lots of different kinds of injustices. And we can talk about that a little more in the Q&A. And even in cases where developed countries have actually provided finance, those investments have then led to what is referred to as carbon colonialism. So even if international justice, as traditionally understood, is done, it will not result in injustices, can only be assured if we have domestic national governments and political institutions that are accountable at large to the public. And so the more we fail to do traditional mitigation, fossil fuel-based mitigations, we are looking at the scary possibilities of geoengineering. And this is already a big chat here in the US and parts of Europe. And it, we can talk about the massive human rights and all kinds of violations linked to the geoengineering options. So the way the international climate justice debates have been framed so far have actually distracted us from thinking about climate change more broadly as part of what some would call as Earth systems governance perspective. And it has also prevented us from thinking about the specific sectors and how they're going to be affected as a result of climate change, and what we need to do to pursue climate justice within the context of forest, and that is now clearly linked to terrestrial carbon emission reductions, agriculture, both global international institutions of World Trade Organization regulations related to agriculture, and the way in which agribusinesses and food corporations have taken control of the world food systems. So we need to be moving from chemical intensive, energy intensive agriculture to an agroecological model of agriculture. Now, that's not just a justice question. It's a question that fundamentally tied to the fossil fuel economies and to the emissions related to the agriculture sector. And so it's ironical that traditionally the agriculture emission was used as an argument against the developing countries. But if you actually look at who controls global agriculture today, it's the global north-based corporations that are actually responsible for a big chunk of the agriculture-related emissions. And so without reforming that system, we can't actually address climate change, or that part of climate change which is caused by the food systems as they exist today. The other part of the justice discussions have to focus on who is already paying for the cost of adaptation. And so there are already a number of studies which shows that poor people are paying for for various measures of climate adaptation, whether in terms of dealing with the health consequences or the consequences of problematic and increasingly precarious access to water and other kinds of resources. But interestingly, we have also found in recent research that poor people are also paying for the transition to renewable energy. Now, we all know that solar parks and wind parks, they all lead to land conflicts and violation of land rights. But poor people are also paying by way of their purchase of chargers and renewable energy or solar-based appliances and those kinds of things. In some cases, those costs are being subsidized by NGO interventions, but increasingly these costs are going to be imposed exclusively on poor people, because they will have to make the switch anyway, sooner than later. I'll finish in 5 minutes. There's been quite a bit of discussion of mining, and interestingly, this discussion in the global north is linked to the discussions of just transition and the workforce that is employed in mining. But it doesn't look like that discussion has taken up in India and in other places. And in fact, in the context of the ongoing pandemic, the coal workers are continuing to work in the mines. Now, and in fact, if you saw Prahlad Joshi's, the minister's tweet, he's also put hashtag coal warriors. coal warriors supporting corona warriors, and things like that. So there are all kinds of weird ways in which these discourses are being deployed in the current context. So I mentioned just transition. We have to be thinking very deeply about what does it mean for the kind of informal economies that we have. How does people who are employed in informal economies, how do these people benefit from the transition that is being talked about? The transition will happen and it will involve changes in labor laws, changes in employment conditions, and changes in the possibilities of different kinds of employment options. And so we have to start a discussion of the type of just transition, even though that framework may not apply in our particular context. So it looks like if we want to think about climate justice in a broader context, we have to expand our discussion from focusing on degrees Celsius and carbon to a discussion of food systems, of mining, of energy options, of labor conditions, and so forth. And this concept of movement of movements is being talked about in the literature on climate justice. But as you all you all know how challenging it can be to bring about a coalition of different movements and to work out a joint strategy. But going forward, that seems to be an increasingly an indispensable kind of option, because without that, none of these sectors are probably going to win out in their bargaining with the government and the industrialists and so forth. So even though there are all kinds of discussions about movements and what movements can do in the context of climate change and climate justice, I think there's a less of a focus on how do movements actually engage with the political system. And here, development studies literature actually provides deep insights on what can be done and how it can be done, and the conditions under which these kinds of engagements between social movements and civil society and the state succeed. And so some of this is from other scholars that I draw on, some of it is my own work, and I want to sort of make three concluding points about what we need to do to promote the engagements between state and society broadly understood. One, as I already said, we need cross-sectoral, cross-scale alliances, and those alliances need to be going beyond the standard sort of the first steps of protesting the unjust actions of government and corporations, and then taking into cognizance the different legal and institutional frameworks that are at our disposal. So Chandan was talking about all of the labor laws that we should be making use of, and we should be demanding that they be enforced properly. So this would apply to all kinds of sectors and processes. The last two important points needs a lot of discussion, which is that we need to create a political economic space for socially just policy options. And again, if we look at right to food movement, if we look at the informal labor movement, the street vendors movement, a lot of these movements actually provide us insights about how those agendas have been pursued in the political system and how they become successful, and what are the limitations of those kinds of processes. And finally, an argument that I made in my work is that these kinds of gains remain successful for a long time if we are able to develop what I call as the mechanisms of political intermediation. So these are mechanisms of ongoing and long-lasting relationships between actors in civil society, social movements, government departments and ministries, as well as the political system. So there have been times both in India and in other cases where these kinds of arrangements have existed, and they have sort of provided a number of important headways in our pursuits of social justice, environmental justice, and so forth. And we need to be focusing on a systematic development of these kinds of mechanisms through which different actors can come together and can realistically negotiate the options that are relevant to our specific societies, not just the models that we borrow from other places. So with that, I will stop my comments, and hopefully we can get into a Q&A now.
Yeah, thank you, Prakash, for that wonderful presentation. You spoke about the just transition framework, and it'll be good if you can briefly share about that, especially in the context of land and the process of decision making that is happening across the world. We've seen here in Karnataka itself where land has been diverted, and the process of taking land has been very unjust to the local communities. There's also the need for water, there's also the need for farming, because food insecurity is becoming a very grave concern among these communities. So in that context, I think introducing to us about the just transition framework would be very helpful.
So I think the just transition framework is still being developed, particularly in the context of global south, because this has come, the concept, as I said earlier, has come from global north, where certain sections of population are and they are politically salient constituencies who are employed in sectors such as coal and other kinds of fossil fuel energy industries. And so the argument is that as we move away from those industries, we should be able to provide alternatives for those people in the workforce related to fossil fuel industries. But in the context of land and other kinds of natural resources, what just transition would mean is that we respect the rights of forest dependent people, peasants, and so forth. And again, I want to emphasize that every time we talk about the justice dimensions of the problem and the transition, it's important to remember that it's not just a social justice question. And I don't want to sort of, by saying that, I don't want to undermine the importance of social justice, but to say that when we have these kinds of protections, we are actually able to hold the corporations and the government actors accountable. So there's a political dimension to the social justice discussions, right, which is separate from for the sake of poor people and so forth. So and the international instruments that can be particularly useful in this context is the UN Declaration of the Rights for Indigenous People and the recently enacted UN Declaration on the Rights of Peasants and other rural people. And this is a brand new declaration, and there's a lot of energy, especially through cosmopolitan transnational movements such as La Via Campesina, who are mobilizing both at the grassroots level, and then they are taking their advocacy from grassroots to the halls of United Nations and other kinds of international institutions. And I know that there are a number of groups in India who are already, have collaborated with La Via Campesina and other kinds of transnational movements. And I think those kinds of solidarities will increasingly be more important, because one thing we have learned is that neither international pressure in isolation nor domestic social movements in isolation can rein in governments such as ours. Our government is, I don't know what phrase to use, but they won't listen unless there's pressure from all sides, right? So in that context, pursuing these kinds of just transition in collaboration with transnational movements and global institutions will probably be helpful and will be important in times to come.
Thank you. We already have questions coming in. So Malati has this question. How can we have socially just policy deliberations when we have state that is based on centralizing tendencies and also in the context of reification of the social, in brackets, inequality, discrimination, onto the political arena?
I think this is a great question, because the way in which inequality has tied into the domestic political process has many times, this reification of inequality has actually undermined the cause of social justice, broadly speaking, and specifically if you're talking about environment and so forth. Um, the experiences both from economic development. So if we look at pre 1990, many of the gains that were made by the industrial labor and other kinds of informal labor, they were made by social movements working in close, I wouldn't say collaboration, but at least pressurizing state governments and other kinds of local government agencies to put in place protections for labor and for informal, for women and other kinds of street vendors, for example. So each of these cases of successful protections of social rights happened because of the strong mobilization from grassroots who were speaking directly to governments at some level, right? And successful change happened in most cases only when these kinds of interlinkages happened. And so to me, I think the fundamental part of this story is uh, to to mobilize and to speak to the government, to mobilize and to resort to what my colleague Manisha Desai and others have called legalism from below. So we mobilize the force of law. Nandini Sundar's work talks about this. That poor people mobilize in favor of enforcement of laws and demanding laws that will then provide us grounds for further negotiations with the industry and with the state, right? So it's sort of a threefold approach of mobilization, working with the policy process, political process to bring about laws, and then continuing to fight to enforce those laws. That to me seems to be the way forward.
Thank you. So we have another question from Saumya Datta. The demands of social justice and environmental justice needs are not always synergistic, both in the larger farmer movements in India specifically, unlike some Latin American movements where there is focus on loan waivers and MSP, whereas little emphasis on environmental consequences of industrial agriculture, and also for the workers' movements in the energy sector. How do you visualize bringing these two views together?
That's a great question. Thank you, Somada. Um, I, if we look at the demand for loan waivers, and there have been analyses of who these demands actually, the section of agricultural communities who are the beneficiaries of these kinds of demands. My sense is that it's a small section, right? But the problem is that, and there's some historical path dependence here, that certain kinds of agricultural movements became very influential in India's political system and in other places. Um, so, so the first thing is that the way in which these demands are articulated in the political system are skewed by the political economy of the relationship between a particular type of agricultural constituency and the political system, which caters to that. If we think about the large sections of India's farmers and peasants, they rely on organic rain-fed agriculture, which does not enjoy the protections of the type that the big farmers actually enjoy. So the answer is that if we are able to, one, mobilize the small farmers and peasants, and then intervene in the domestic political economy so that their demands, the demand of the majority of farmers, are heard, then there will be a greater sort of harmony between the goals of promoting agroecological kind of agriculture and the goals of climate action and climate justice. So that's one part. In Latin America, I think the situation is slightly different, and I'm very biased on this because I made a strong argument about there being some fundamental differences between the political systems in large parts of Asia and Africa and political systems in Latin America. Unless people have actually understood these systems in a comparative, systematic basis, some of those comparisons are actually erroneous. So if you think about La Via Campesina, its success has been driven quite significantly by the strong collaboration between the labor movements and peasant movements in Latin America, and also the indigenous peoples movement in Latin America. So if we have agroecology on the global public policy discussions, it actually owes to peasants movements. And to the extent that agroecological farming is crucial to our fight against climate change, I would say that's already an evidence that these two things can go together under certain conditions. And so the difference between Latin America and other parts is not in the nature of agriculture or nature of the workforce, but it's how peasants and other marginalized communities engage with the political system. And that engagement, again, is a crucial thing to understand and probably learn from some of that for our own activism.
Thank you. We have a question from Vijayan. Thank you, Dr. Prakash, also for talking about disaster authoritarianism. It has been something that I have been consistently raising questions even in the Solidarity series. Can you please talk about what you think about the contradiction between the people oppressed by this authoritarianism and why they could still go on to be votaries to the same right-wing and conservative megalomaniacs, despite the knowledge that they contribute negatively to the lives of the marginalized peoples? Is there a learning there to build a new progressive civic movement / alliance?
This this is a very tough, and I think probably a proper discussion will take a very long time. So probably we should connect after the call. But I think the short answer is that poor people's actions must be understood in the context within which they live. And one thing that I should have said about my past experience was that I've done quite a bit of work on grassroots, engaging with communities and helping develop some local institutions and so forth. And if there's one thing that we understand from a dispassionate, in-depth, nuanced study of the political subjectivities of poor people, it is that if our liberal framework, right, and I'm using that word very, very loosely there, but if the progressive liberal framework did not actually fundamentally benefit the poor people in ways that were keeping pace with the changing times, then that's not the basis for us to engage with the masses, right? So we have to have an economic program, we have to have an agricultural program, we have to have a labor program that is fundamentally beneficial to the masses. And it's up to us to demonstrate that this is not just ideological, and it's actually, there are material benefits that are attached to it. I think we'll have a greater success in disseminating and communicating some of the underlying ideological arguments. Because if you think about the whole debate about secularism versus development in India, I think that's a very skewed discussion. We fail to kind of relate to the fundamental material economic context within which poor people live. So sorry, that, yeah, I hope that it's some answer to your really rich question, and we should really talk.
Thank you. So we have our next question from Ashok Chowdhury. Right to food movement you have referred has a wider representation, but in the question of right to resource, it has a very limited political goal. It depends on political space given by the state, whereas movements for land rights and forest rights have more specific and focused political goal, that is right to resource and for community governance. Unless the producers of food have right over resources, no security for food can be ensured, especially in a neoliberal regime. Please comment, he says.
Thank you, Ashokta. Yes, I think the struggle for land and forest rights and other kinds of resource rights, including mining, is a much more difficult struggle in some ways. And the 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 political space has been constrained precisely because it is so important, right? The stakes are high for the state and for the corporate sector, and so they've made sure that the political space that all of you've been fighting for ages is not made available, and that's it's systematically kept constrained even before the current regime took hold of the system in a very bad way. Um, so yeah, I'd say I agree with your comment. And there's the only thing that I want to add is the there's a big gap, and again this goes back to the question that Mr. Vijayan asked beforehand, which is that if you think about the land acquisition ordinance in 2014 and the way in which it was subverted by a concerted, organized opposition in combination with political parties and social movements. It's interesting to see what has happened to the question of land acquisition since then. The BJP government withdrew the ordinance, but then it went systematically amending the state acquisition laws. And almost all of the BJP states today have land acquisition laws that are worse than the 1867 law. And so I share this with some amount of disappointment of not um, gaining from the success that was achieved in our struggle against the land ordinance, and how that space was ceded primarily by the Congress party. So I think the political parties are at a big fault here, but I also think that social movements may have dropped the ball as well. And so I think these kinds of experiences should allow us to reflect more deeply about how to continue to fight for these political spaces. And again, we need a big coalition that focuses on land and forest and other kinds of mines and so forth. So we need a resource rights kind of coalition which brings together all of these different movements. And I know that some of you have been working on that already for many, many years.
Thank you. Our next question is from Amani. In the context of the forest rights legislation, despite the progressive and transformative power of the act itself, especially since the Modi regime, the implementation and enforcement is left to apathetic institutions complicit in structural violence against Adivasi communities. Could you talk about ways in which this can be overcome to realize climate justice?
So Forest Rights Act has two parts. One is the part related to the household land claims, and the other part is the collective forest rights. And I'm being a very reflective person today, so please bear with me. I having learned from social movements, sometimes I think it's a little tricky to sort of talk about these questions in ways that do justice to the intensity of the struggle that has been waged and some of the limitations that are still need to be addressed. So at least for some time there was a defensive formulation of Forest Rights Act as the whole Adivasis live in harmony with nature kind of discourse, and that to some extent undermined the extent to which land rights could be advocated, and I'm talking about the household land rights. And without a strong advocacy and implementation of the land rights provision of the FRA, in large parts of the country, the fight for collective forest rights was always going to be difficult, because these two things are intimately connected, and we cannot sort of be defensive about sort of giving up the militancy of the demands on land rights in favor of this kind of harmonious discourse that says that Adivasis protect forest, and so Forest Rights Act is mainly about these collective forest rights. I think that undermine the extent to which the advocacy could be pursued in among the masses. That's my finding from some of the recent conversations at the grassroots level and with some of the activists in private. So going forward, I think legalism from below is an important means. There are provisions of the Forest Rights Act which holds for the officials accountable, and in addition to the grassroots advocacy, any of us who have any amount of say anywhere in the social media space, or in mainly in particularly in the political space and policy process, we should demand to hold the Ministry of Environment and Forest and forestry agencies accountable. And in this context, some of the environmental activists have been a bit shy, because they think that forest department, working with forest department is important for the sake of environmental protections. Um, it's actually, there's really no evidence to suggest that forest department has made meaningful contributions to the agenda of environmental conservation in any significant way. And so I think we have to sort of, bring back some of the militancy of the land rights movement for the sake of the success of the overall forest rights movement. I hope I made myself clear.
Thank you. We have Ashwin asking, lots of development projects are made in the name of the poor, but actually benefit the rich / corporations. It's clear that in India, at least, that Modi's rhetoric through the mainstream media has convinced a majority of the masses, including the very people who suffer the brunt of this government's injustices. How can we combat this rhetoric and bring more attention to the facts?
Right. So obviously this is a big challenge, and a massive, massive movement on the streets is the only way out. But that movement, building that movement itself has become problematic, partly because of the gross precarity that affects most poor people. And in that precarity, they kind of hold on to whatever they think is available from the current system. And so I think we are in a dire situation, and without the middle classes taking on some kind of militancy in a conceptual sense, not militancy as in violence sense, but taking on active, proactive, and very aggressive kind of social advocacy. Um, this seems to be a really formidable challenge.
Oh, we have Vandana. How can the climate justice concept embrace the idea of justice for non-humans and ecosystems while also being deeply connected with social justice for humans? Some indigenous people have, for example, used the idea of personhood of ecosystem to protect such ecosystems from the greed of corporations, example, the Maori and the Wangani river system.
So again, to continue to be in the reflective mode, I assume we are all familiar with the basic arguments. So we all agree on the role of indigenous people, the role of forest dependent people at large. But an unfortunate outcome of the valorization of indigenous people and other forest dependent people has been that we have put indigenous people in the frame of sort of noble savages kind of discourse. We expect them to be living harmoniously with nature. Now that can become problematic once we talk about the agency of indigenous people. What if they don't want to live in harmony with nature at their present level of development? Then our framework of sort of relying on indigenous wisdom seem to crack a little bit. So I think what is important is to learn from indigenous wisdom, bring into the mainstream science policy making process, so that the burden is not put on indigenous people to live those kinds of ideals. We should all start living those ideals while allowing the indigenous people, Adivasis, and other forest dependent people some freedom and agency to pursue their development in ways that they may want to pursue. And so, that's on the indigenous side. And I think we do gain deep insights by thinking about the role of the non-human species. But again, once we start reifying or valorizing the non-human species rights discourse, we forget that species have been devastated, the degradation has been caused because of human agency. And fixing environmental degradation requires assigning blame and responsibility and accountability. And so only when we actually think about the rights of non-human species in conjunction with the rights, responsibilities, accountabilities of human species, then we can actually do justice to this idea of interspecies justice. That's my limited understanding. That's not my area of expertise, though.
Thank you. Ashokta has a comment to make to your response earlier. Also, he says, unfortunately, most of the members of the Via Campesina in India do not represent the landless and poor peasants. So its international appeal and demands do not reach in India.
So that, all I can say is that we should probably expand that collaboration to include, if that is actually the case, then we should definitely be reaching out to La Via Campesina and saying that, there are other movements that you got to be engaging with. And I am, getting into some dialogue, both in terms of the UN Declaration on rights of peasants and other rural people, as well as sort of thinking about the agroecological model of La Via Campesina. So Ashok, I'll definitely reach out to you, and we should have these discussions more, after this.
Thank you. So we have Leo. So he says, hello, Prakash. What I find happening in the lockdown is a devastation of fundamental rights and freedoms. I feel the extent of this devastation has been contributed to the weakening of synergies across different progressive movements. With the reductionist approach on tackling everything from the pandemic to climate change, do you feel we have regressed quite substantially in holding on to significant gains made over the past half century, especially these past few weeks when brutal emergencies have been unleashed with very sporadic critical engagements?
So as a society, thank you, Leo. As a society, we have definitely regressed. But see, this is the dilemma, right? So once you have a declaration of an emergency, there's actually practically very little that civil society and social movements can do to intervene in that ongoing situation. And this actually dawned upon me while I was preparing for this talk, that and that should actually really make us have serious thoughts about this whole notion of climate emergencies. I mean, I would personally never utter that word again, because as we have seen, once this is deployed in by political actors, we have no way of controlling things. And of course, they've been, it seems that, if you look at all the laws and amendments that are being brought about, it looks like before the declaration of the lockdown, a great deal of preparation was put into what to be done after the lockdown is announced. And that was not thinking about migrant laborers and agricultural farmers and informal workers and so forth, but that was thinking about sort of disaster authoritarianism, right? How do I make the most of this situation where I have all of these powers and the public media attention completely focused on the pandemic situation? So yeah, I think it's and I didn't want to talk at all about the whole the science society interface in the context of the pandemic, but I think our challenge vis-a-vis COVID is only beginning to show up now. And so things are going to be very dire. And, I think we should continue to talk about all the different ways in which this can be thought about, written about, and if possible, intervened in some ways.
Thank you. We have another question from Vijayan. It says, can we say that the disaster will have separate and differentiated learnings for the conservation lobby, as well as the rights-based community movements? Do you think the latter could use COVID disaster as a point of turning around the power equation with the conservationists?
So if I understand your question correctly, I think the exclusionary conservation lobby, right? So there's a group that Half the Earth movement, which demands that half the Earth should be set aside for the goals of nature and wildlife conservation. Those kinds of arguments will definitely benefit in the global political economy. It seems that they are already beginning to prepare grounds for those kinds of discussions. Now, whether the rights community can benefit from what we have learned from pandemic is, I think, quite contingent on how the global solidarity movement comes together and frames these demands within the context of international policy debates. So I think in a number of countries, they have learned good lessons and they are beginning to sort of enact more progressive, more inclusionary policies. And so, one, we have to develop the concrete policy models that would allow um, the, the, the simultaneous pursuit of something like climate change and climate justice. But also, we have to be working transnationally to make sure that we are utilizing all possible international institutions we can to pressurize governments that may not be inclined to take on to learn in good ways, right? There are governments who will be learning in not so good ways. And so then the question is, how do we actually benefit from the learnings that we have gained, even though those are not the learning that the political decision makers are taking away from this pandemic. So I think it will be, as usual, it will be a constant ongoing struggle in the times to come. And I continue to think that transnational solidarity and strategic deployment of international institutions will be very, very crucial, in addition to the domestic political struggles.
Thank you. We have a question from Gaurav. In the context of this crisis, do you see a sustained and serious long-term effort to mitigate climate crisis and the change in approaches towards ensuring climate justice?
So one argument that many of the enlightened climate activists have made already in the press is that the lessons from the COVID lockdowns are not that we can actually do this, because COVID is not same as fighting the climate change problem. And so they are doubling down on this argument that we should be thinking about the long-term processes that need to be put in place and then need to be institutionalized for us to address the climate change problem. What they're taking from the pandemic is this notion that global disasters can put brakes on everything that we hold dear, right? So in the Western context, it's the lifestyle, your parties, your play things, and everything that you do socially has been completely undermined because of this crisis. And so the argument is to use these kinds of experiences to convince people that you got to be acting on climate change. So I think in that sense, to the extent that these movements, these activists can win these arguments, it will definitely add to the momentum on climate action. But on the other hand, if we look at what's happening in the US, how the relief package has been systematically handed over to big corporations, we also can expect a big bounce back from bounce back in terms of more emissions, more kind of dirty kind of development and so forth. Maruti, for example, already announced some kind of ad that they're running to say that it's safer to travel in your car, right? So I think this will cut both ways, and it remains to be seen which of these two sides will actually hold a gain out of this process.
Thank you. Ashokta has one more comment to make. He says, Prakash very well said about effective implementation of FRA, which demands militant approach like land right movement. So okay.
Thank you, Ashokta. Right.
We move on to the next question from Saumya Datta. The COVID-19 crisis has shown that unless everyone is safe from the virus in physical sense, no one is safe due to the continuing circulation in human population. How can this learning be broad-based to highlight the essential concept of risk minimization for all over gain maximization for a few?
So, I think there's one way in which this can become a winning argument for climate change, precisely from this particular analytical point, is if we were to argue that these pandemics will become more common as a result of climate change, and then they will unfold simultaneously in conjunction with disasters related to climate change. I think that makes a powerful, broader appeal to the middle classes. But we can't say that this was pandemic and similarly climate change will affect everybody, right? So that's the argument that doesn't work, because we know that climate change doesn't affect everybody in the same way. In fact, if you think about the melting of the Arctic ice shield, and the ways in which it will actually cut down on the cost of transportation of minerals and oils, there are a number of actors who are waiting keenly for climate change to accelerate so that they can actually benefit from, right? So I think um, P. Sainath was way ahead of his time when he said everybody loves a good drought. There are lots of people who are really loving the way climate change crisis is unfolding. And so I think, I think this will be a difficult sell unless we can actually, connect climate change producing more pandemics, which then producing more kinds of disruptions of the lifestyles that the middle class and the upper middle class and the rich people actually like.
Thank you. So we have a question from Abhay Raj. Dear Prakash, thanks for the great presentation. Quick clarifications and questions on two elements here. One, if climate action in the carbon reductionism sense does not equal climate justice, does that imply we must redefine climate action to necessarily include justice claims, understood here as human rights for all before everything else? How can we ensure that pursuing this approach does not lead to environmental harms and slash or further inequalities as it unfolds? And what is the temporality here? And there's a little bit more. I'll just finish reading his question. If this boils down to balancing environment and human rights, does this not return to Indira Gandhi's approach to sustainable development, which, as we saw, was totally perverted in its implementation to further exacerbate inequality and continues to be deployed by the present BJP government?
Right. Thank you for that wonderful question. As I said, I think there's, this notion of thinking about. So first, to answer your first question, no, we cannot actually reframe climate action as human rights first kind of argument. And I say that because that fundamentally undermines the strength of the argument in favor of a socially just climate action. But the right way to do is to sort of focus on the interventions that are both climate friendly and are sort of redistributive in nature. And that includes agroecology, that includes decentralized, community owned renewable energy, that includes fossil fuel, cutting down on fossil fuel subsidies, that includes promoting public transport, that, so all of these kinds of interventions actually have the dual function of addressing climate action as well as providing redistributive gains for the poor and the marginalized. So our entry, and these, in the literature on climate change, these are called the co-benefits approach. And I tend to argue that, it sure is co-benefits approach, but if we think about the political dimensions of co-benefits approach, and if we account also for the fact that, if we broaden the ambit of the beneficiaries of climate action, we have more people who will be invested in demanding good policies and holding government accountable, holding corporations accountable. So there's a political accountability dimension to expansion of the beneficiaries of climate action. So I would say that, the way forward would be to sort of look at these kinds of climate actions with very significant co-benefits in the mainstream language. But I would argue that, you know, these two agendas are fundamentally tied in many, many ways, and they should be pursued as such. Now, if there are certain um, interventions, so let's say we want to provide computers and multimedia instruments to all the schools in the country, right? So that is a big energy sort of demand on that. Um, so if you want to think about this as a sort of trade-off, fine, let's think of this as a trade-off. But this is something that we need to do, to promote good quality education with best means that are accessible to anybody in the world. We should do that same for rural schools and all kinds of schools in India. But if we actually think about how much of carbon budget that's going to consume versus how much of carbon budget is consumed by people flying in their chartered planes. So if we really want to talk about trade-offs, we should actually, let's say, shut down all the chartered planes, for example, right? And so if we are actually talking about trade-offs, there are all kinds of interventions that we can, address in the context of promoting climate action without actually sacrificing the need for human development and human rights. I hope that helps.
Yeah, his question also had a second part, which probably you briefly touched upon. It says, could you comment more on spaces and mechanisms for just policy dialogues and political mediation? Isn't the legal policy political system in India fundamentally structured to dissipate radical rearrangement of sovereignty?
So, in terms of sort of conceptually speaking, something like National Advisory Council, which brought together social activists, policymakers, government officials, and which, if we think about all of the progressive laws that we have in India today, a big chunk of those laws were enacted during the UPA first and in the early phases of UPA second regime. And so, I think this was a result of that kind of collaboration between civil society, social movements, government, and all kinds of sectors. Now, of course, it was not perfect, and there were lots of problems with the way the NSC was constituted and implemented. But conceptually speaking, that model is what I mean. In the Indian context, that is an example of political intermediation mechanism. If you look elsewhere, for example, I was talking about Latin America earlier, because of a variety of historical factors, labor constituencies as well as peasants actually have a significant leverage within the political system in many of the Latin American countries, if not all. And so the connection between legalism from below and the macro policy initiatives actually works through the political pressurizing tactics, and in many cases the incentives that political leaders have to engage with the masses or labor or peasants and so forth, right? So I hope that addresses part of your question.
And then we have Preeta. This is the last question. Preeta says the dilution of environmental laws are happening hugely in India, and that the agency of poor people and their resource rights are taking away. Then how do they mobilize, and what is the weapon to fight against?
Right. So the only way that I can think of, and many senior veteran activists who are present in this webinar right now, they would probably be much better equipped to answer this question. But I can think of the threefold points that I made in the penultimate slide, which is to mobilize, to connect across sectors and across scales, which means that we need local movements connected to regional movements, connected to national movements, sort of federating kind of approach, which in turn then are able to wield some kind of leverage in the political system. And that leverage could be leverage of strike. If we are able to organize the industrial labor, farm workers, and street vendors, and all kinds of service providers, if there's a massive working class movement in the country. So that's one kind of leverage. The other kind of leverage could be voting power if we mobilize enough constituencies. And so the way I think about this, and I'm sure there are other kinds of ideas out there, but the way I think about this is this kind of triangular approach to grassroots mobilization, federating of different kinds of movements and mobilizations, movement of movements, which then exerts different kinds of leverages within the political and economic system.
Before we close, I think a big thank you to Dr. Kashwan, because I think it was a very timely topic, because we had heard almost a whole range of sectors, and to come and look at climate change and COVID-19 was like, I think, really awakening and help put all other sessions in place for me, at least. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks so much.